probes that included secret subpoenas on House Democrats perceived to be Trump's political enemies. And the White House had this to say about the reports.
First of all, an IG investigation looks into how this happened, how it could possibly happen. And let me be absolutely clear. The behavior, these actions, the president finds them absolutely appalling. He ran for president in part because of the abuse of power by the last president and by the last attorney general.
As we heard from Jen Psaki, the White House is appalled, and now the Justice Department is investigating. For the latest, let's go to CNN's crime and justice reporter, Katelyn Polantz, who joins us now live from D.C. Katelyn, what's the latest on this? What potential consequences could Attorney William Barr face if he's found to have done something inappropriate?
Well, I'm going to start from the beginning here because there is a lot to cover over what has prompted this Inspector General investigation. We essentially have a five-alarm fire about the stewardship of the Justice Department during the Trump administration. And that is not just about Attorney General William Barr, but it is also about the leadership of the predecessor of Barr, Attorney General Jeff Sessions. And so all of these developments over the past week led to the Justice Department's independent watchdog, the Inspector General, announcing that he would be doing a review of the collection of data of both news media and people on the Hill, including members of Congress. And so what we had learned, and this is all coming out now because gag orders are lifted. Those are court orders that were saying that news organizations that had their data collected, their reporters' email data collected, couldn't disclose that that had been collected. There were also gag orders on Apple regarding a subpoena that had been sent to Apple in 2018. Now that's before Barr, under the Sessions tenure of the Justice Department, where Apple had been asked for metadata on 73 phone numbers and 36 email addresses that dated back to the inception of those accounts. That was for a number of people on the Hill, a minor, and also two members of Congress, Democrats Eric Swalwell and Adam Schiff, both in the House. Now, that gag order that had been on that congressional subpoena was extended 3 times. So that is the course of the Trump administration, and then seems to have just petered off in May of this year when it was lifted. And now we're learning about all of these attempts to investigate leaks because those gag orders are lifted. Now, in addition to that, Barr, our sources were telling us that Barr had really reinvigorated leak investigations in the Justice Department once he became the Attorney General in 2019. This had always been a priority for the Trump administration. Here's Trump in 2017 and then again in 2020.
I've actually called the Justice Department to look into the leaks. Those are criminal leaks. I think it was leaks from the Intelligence Committee, House version, and I think that they leaked it. I think probably Schiff leaked it.
And what we've learned now is that from our sources, Evan Perez and I are reporting as of yesterday that Barr doesn't recall what happened with this subpoena that swept up congressional information or data regarding the members, and Sessions was not involved in that subpoena in 2018. Back to you.
Katelyn, if I could follow up, just to put things in context here, because we know that Department of Justice leak investigations, that's routine. Talk to us a little bit about what in these cases steps outside the boundaries of normal.
It's a great question. I mean, the way that this normally works is that the Justice Department regularly is going about sweeping up data for investigations. They go to all kinds of service providers when they're doing these sorts of things. They get court orders, they get subpoenas from grand juries, and they rope in data. What normally doesn't happen is there typically are extra steps that must be taken in order to get data from news organizations and especially members of Congress. Members of Congress really are protected as a branch of government. There's the speech and debate clause that brings in all kinds of additional things that you have to think about if the Justice Department is going to pursue information out of members of Congress. And so all of these things put together, and then in addition to that, the gag orders, I mean, that is really an extraordinary step to put on news organizations especially.
The fact that we're only finding about this because of them expiring too. Katelyn Polantz, appreciate your reporting from Washington. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Well,
It is Saturday, June 12th. Thank you so much for starting your day with us. We're thrilled to have you, and we're thrilled to have Amber with us as well.
I learned a new word today, cruciferous.
Cruciferous. Yeah, you
Cruciferous
nailed
vegetables.
it.
I didn't even know what that was. Cauliflower and broccoli. Yummy.
And wasabi, apparently, too.
Is very good for you. Yeah. A lot of news to get to and underway right now. The world's major economies are meeting for day 2 of the G7 summit.
Yeah, on the agenda, building back the global economy post-pandemic, with a specific focus on competing with China. And for President Biden, signing a global health declaration to make sure another crisis like the COVID pandemic does not happen again.
Joe Biden's first outing on the world stage as president is a chance to put his America is back mantra into practice. And so far, the visuals are matching the message. Allies side by side for so-called family photos. Also, arm in arm with French President Emmanuel Macron. Those two leaders set to hold a bilateral meeting soon with serious disagreements over China and trade on the table.
Yeah, looming over everything that's happening at the G7, though, President Biden's first face-to-face with Vladimir Putin in Switzerland. The Russian president laying out his view on the state of relations between the two nations this way. Listen. Let's get straight to England and CNN's Jeff Zeleny, who joins us now live from Falmouth. Jeff, before meeting with Putin, Biden has a series of big issues to tackle with the G7. Walk us through the agenda and how this is setting the stage, not just for his meetings with Putin, but also for his NATO meetings in Brussels.
Good morning, Boris. The President Biden and other leaders of the Group of Seven Nations are meeting right now. They're about an hour or so into their second full day of meetings here in Cornwall, England. And topic A is China. Of course, China does not have a seat at the table here, but they are on the agenda in every direction. And speaking to administration officials just a few moments ago, they are outlining some deep divisions that go beyond the nice photo opportunities here of all the leaders smiling, but some deep divisions among members of the G7 nations. Just one quick example, Germany and Italy want to foster a broader relationship with China. The fact is they want to sell goods like cars and other products, but the U.S., France, and other nations want to take a harder line on China. We are told that President Biden in this closed session delivered very strong words against China and the forced labor that is going on in that. So this is one of the challenges here, that these leaders are going to try and come together and build some type of consensus on a communique about China. But this meeting underway right now, it's more contentious than actually was expected, so we'll keep an eye on that. But all of this is coming as there's some lighter moments here as well. We saw at a reception last evening, Queen Elizabeth flew here to Cornwall on the Atlantic coast of England and met with these leaders in pictures we frankly don't see all that often, particularly in the wake of the global pandemic. She's largely been held up for the last year plus, not leaving Windsor Castle, but she is here in Cornwall, and you can see these images here mingling with President Biden, First Lady Jill Biden, and other world leaders. So pretty interesting sights there. They will have a private audience with her tomorrow in Windsor Castle. Now, all of this is leading into that summit, as you said, with Russian President Vladimir Putin on Wednesday in Geneva. We are learning new information this morning. The White House now saying that President Biden will be holding a solo news conference after a series of meetings on Wednesday in Geneva. Will not be holding, at least as of now, a joint news conference with Vladimir Putin. This is why this is significant. We all remember these images from 3 summers ago, July 2018, in Helsinki, Finland, when former President Donald Trump met with Russian President Vladimir Putin and then came side by side with him at this press conference and really denied U.S. intelligence information about Russian interference in the election and sided with Vladimir Putin. That was a moment that certainly was criticized around the world. Being in Helsinki then, I certainly remember how contentious that was. But this White House, President Biden, as of now, they are not scheduled to hold a joint press conference. They do not simply want to elevate Putin in that same type of way. So both sides will give their own versions of events of that meeting. So all of that is coming up next week. But for here, at least, for the next several hours, President Biden and other leaders will be meeting. And then later this afternoon here, President Biden holding his first one-on-one meeting directly with French President Emmanuel Macron. We saw them yesterday arm in arm. But they also have some some differences and issues to work out. So for all the talk of receptions and photo opportunities, yes, that's happening, but some contentious issues here, largely revolving around China.
It's quite an interesting development there with some disagreements over China. Jeff Zeleny, appreciate your reporting in England for us. Thank you.
Plenty for us to discuss, so let's get to it. We have CNN's international diplomatic editor Nick Robertson, who is in Carbis Bay, England for the G7 summit. And also joining us is Susan Glasser, CNN global affairs analyst and a staff writer for The New Yorker. Nick, you were on the ground there at the G7. It looks and sounds like these leaders are getting along, and the family photo and the great pictures, the embraces we're seeing. But in the way of substance, especially when it comes to Biden's goal of presenting a united front against China, what are you anticipating will come of this G7?
Well, the underlying difference here is that the European Union wants to trade with China more than the United States does. We saw that because just before President Biden came into office, the EU finalized a financial deal with China. Now they've held back on some elements of it, part in deference to President Biden. But there's that fundamental difference there. And for many of the sort of European Union leaders, the measures that President Biden want to take perhaps go too far. Now, he's laying this out as, look, China has human rights abuses of its Uyghur population. It's using them as forced labor. When you use people as forced labor, you have an unfair trade advantage because you can produce goods for less. And he wants there to be a set of concrete measures. So when all these partners see a country like China, in this case, abusing its population in this way, that there will be concrete actions. Now, Europeans are a little bit worried because will they get a President Trump type character back in 4 years' time after another U.S. election, or will they get President Biden for another 4 years? That's really a question in people's minds. So they've got to decide how heavily do they go in behind the United States, or how much independence they try to retain, and that's an ongoing issue. So I think what we've heard from leaders so far is they want to hear concrete facts and substance from President Biden around the table, more than just sort of rhetoric that we've heard so far, that will convince them that this is a time to align more strongly behind the United States.
Susan, Nick raises a critical underlying point that we have to keep in mind during these meetings, and I want to share with our viewers a portion of your new piece in The New Yorker on President Biden's objectives for the trip. You write, quote, "The main accomplishment of this Biden trip will not come from the policy debates that inevitably occur between allies. The win here is that it is happening at all. The fact that Biden and not Trump is president virtually guarantees him a successful international debut. All Biden has to do, in some sense, is show up." To Nick's point, some European leaders have expressed skepticism about American democracy, given Trump's shadow, his America First policies, the impact of the big lie. How does presenting stability at home become a challenge for Biden?
Well, that's right. I mean, on the one hand, President Biden, just by showing up, I think, does benefit politically. And remember, these allies, Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, they remember very well what it was like to deal with Donald Trump. They didn't like it. He berated them in public and in private. He threatened to blow up the NATO alliance. Called the European Union, our closest allies, a foe, actually, and an enemy who was as problematic as our worst adversaries. So one question for the Europeans is how much are they going to remember what it was like to deal with Donald Trump and decide that now's the time to embrace Joe Biden? But I do think it's a low bar for Biden on a personal level to clear with these leaders. Now, to the bigger political question, I think that's where there's some true challenge. Joe Biden has framed his foreign policy doctrine in many ways as this being a key moment in history, almost an inflection point. That's the word he uses between rising autocracies like China and, to a lesser extent, Russia versus democracies and the West. And the question is, if he can't rally half of the American democracy and they see this rigid polarization inside the United States, to what extent does his entire concept that I'm going to rally the rest of the world really work? And so that's a big big frame challenge. But remember also, Europeans have their own political challenges. They're not necessarily ready for a big foreign policy change right now. Angela Merkel is on her way out after an incredible run as chancellor. Emmanuel Macron faces a very difficult re-election bid. So this isn't necessarily a moment to do more than agree on some common principles.
Yeah, so Biden has his hands full at the G7. Of course, looming over all of this is Russia and the upcoming summit between Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin. Biden so far has kept quiet on his message to Putin. Putin speaking out in a rare interview. I want to play some sound, a preview of that upcoming interview. Here he is contrasting Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Listen. Isn't it, it's fascinating to watch Vladimir Putin frame how this summit is going to go. And now we're getting the sort of White House framing of this when we learn that Biden is going to hold a solo press conference following their meeting. Typically, the Russians push to have a dual press conference. What is the significance to you of this announcement that Biden is going to come out and speak to the press on his own?
Well, I suppose there's probably a lot of relief among his advisors on that. The ghost of Helsinki, as Jeff pointed out, looms large over this entire Putin summit because it was such an extraordinary moment to see Donald Trump agreeing with Putin over his own intelligence agencies at that press conference. I was there as well. It was really just a shocking moment in many ways. So Biden doesn't want to repeat that. However, I do think it's interesting to see Vladimir Putin and his approach to this. Remember that as a former KGB man, I was there for the first interview that Western correspondents did with Vladimir Putin, I'm embarrassed to say, 2 decades ago now. And he's a man who reads his briefing book and likes to spit it back to you. So I find it interesting that that's his briefing. You know, Joe Biden, you won't find any abrupt movements from him. He's not going to shock me with anything. He's a career man, a professional. That's interesting. It's not necessarily the insult that perhaps it's being portrayed as. I think it reflects that Putin is very calculating, and I think he and Biden are both very realistic about what they're getting out of this. In some ways, they both will walk away and tell their domestic audiences that they were the tough guy against the adversary.
Nothing to be embarrassed about being well versed on these matters, Susan. Nick, similarly, you have a lot of experience covering global issues and summits like these. What does it say to you that Joe Biden is going to go out on his own and speak to the press instead of having Vladimir Putin by his side?
Yeah, I think it's he has to do it for domestic consumption. I think he has to explain, because there's a lot of pressure on him to explain. Does he confront Putin about Alexei Navalny, about the essentially the trashing of any realistic political opposition in Russia? Does he confront him about the buildup of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine? These are questions that people want to know. That President Biden has been tough where President Trump wasn't with Vladimir Putin. So I think there's been that level of pressure on President Biden to do that. But also as well, I mean, let's think also about how more broadly the Russian press, and for here, when we say Russian press, let's read Vladimir Putin, have been portraying President Biden until now, and that is essentially as a doddering old man. So there's no way that there's no way rather that Putin is going to want to be in a position where he's next to President Biden, where President Biden is trying to, or getting away with, or in any way scoring points against him, because he's portraying him, on the one hand saying that he's part of the sort of political establishment who's got a lot of experience, he's been in foreign policy forever, we don't expect anything new or different from him, framing a low bar for what can be achieved out of these talks, but he's also been framing him as somebody who's basically incapable of running major office and potentially, could fall by the wayside during his 4 years.
Insightful and clever analysis as always. Susan Glasser, Nick Robertson, thank you both.
And just in time for the warming weather, more cities and summer attractions are reopening and dropping COVID-19 restrictions. But lagging vaccination rates across the U.S. could leave some areas vulnerable to potential outbreaks and new COVID-19 variants.
Yeah, the country averaged just over 1 million COVID-19 vaccine doses administered per day over the last week. That is down from over 3 million per day in early April. It's happening just as more businesses look to return to normal, including Disney. Beginning next week, masks will no longer be required in most areas at Disney World for vaccinated guests. CNN's Polo Sandoval reports on efforts to reopen across the country.
Restrictions continue being lifted across the United States as more cities and states start fully reopening. On Friday, Chicago's mayor announced that Windy City has dropped pandemic-era regulations, no more mask mandate or social distancing requirements, even offering some free tickets to its famed Lollapalooza music festival to vaccinated fans.
And now it's time for you to get up, get out of the house this summer and fully and safely and enjoy the events of the best city on the planet, our beloved city of Chicago.
This week, other major cities like Seattle and Denver crossed the Biden administration's goal of having 70% of the adult population vaccinated with at least one dose by the 4th of July. New York State, on the cusp of reaching that goal, it's a threshold the state's Governor Andrew Cuomo has said will trigger the end to all of the state's COVID-19 restrictions. New Yorkers can also plan on the return of the famed Macy's fireworks for Independence Day, according to New York Mayor Bill de Blasio. But vaccination rates in certain states remain relatively low, including in states like Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and Wyoming. While adults and children over 12 continue receiving vaccines across the United States, nearly 62% of that population has at least one dose so far, and experts are split on how urgently children under the age of 12 should receive their vaccine.
They are still at risk of hospitalization and they are still at risk of having adverse side effects. Kids have been isolated for a large proportion of time, but as school starts back in the fall and they're in classrooms, they're in group activities and school sports, it's going to get colder, so people are going to start moving inside. Their risk is going to increase if they're not vaccinated.
Another concern among experts, the mental health of adolescents during the pandemic. Emergency room visits for suicide attempts rose an alarming 51% among teenage girls during the pandemic. That's according to a new study by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention released on Friday. But there remain signs of optimism in the global fight against the pandemic. The Food and Drug Administration has authorized the use of 2 batches of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that were produced at a troubled Baltimore lab, concluding they're safe to use. Polo Sandoval, CNN, New York.
Polo, thank you so much for that. Let's discuss all things COVID with Dr. Leana Wen, a CNN medical analyst, former City of Baltimore Health Commissioner, and Washington Post contributing columnist. Dr. Wen, always great to see you. Let's start with the CDC saying that it's monitoring a number of cases where young people who've recently received a COVID vaccine experienced heart inflammation. The nation's top health agency says that these cases are rare. What would you tell parents who are concerned about it?
I would say that it's really important for us to follow the guidance of our federal health officials. The CDC and the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, have shown us during this pandemic that they will use an abundance of caution and that they are monitoring this very closely. So this is a condition called myocarditis, the inflammation of the heart muscle, and it appears to be very rare, but it is something that's being investigated as to whether it could be related to the vaccine. Important to note that myocarditis is generally very mild. People who end up going to the hospital will usually be discharged, and to date, no one has died from this condition here in the U.S., and so something to be investigated. However, we also should consider that myocarditis occurs with coronavirus, and in fact, that coronavirus has killed more than 300 children here in the U.S. And so parents should ask questions, should follow the guidance of health officials. And by the way, the CDC advisors are actually meeting next week in order to discuss whether there's actually causation involved between the getting the vaccine and having this rare, but again, tend to be mild heart condition.
Yeah, so important to have that perspective. There does appear to be some disagreement among certain FDA advisors regarding children younger than 12 getting vaccinated right now. Some FDA, well, at least one FDA advisor, I should say, is warning against it. Another FDA advisor has called it silly. What do you make of this debate?
Look, I think it's a reasonable conversation for us to have about risks and benefits. Of course, that's the same thing that we would be discussing for any medication or any vaccine. But we also have to be looking at the facts here. And the fact is that about 4 million children have been diagnosed with coronavirus since the beginning of the pandemic. More than 300 have died. Tens of thousands have been hospitalized because of this. And so this is not a benign condition for children. I have young kids of my own, a 1-year-old and an almost 4-year-old. I cannot wait for them to be able to get the vaccine. Of course, I want to make sure that it's safe. But my husband and I are limiting our activities. We're certainly not getting back to pre-pandemic normal until our kids are able to be vaccinated. And I think a lot of parents feel that way too.
I also wanted to ask you about the Delta variant. Dr. Anthony Fauci warning that as we watch it ravage India and as it becomes the dominant strain in the United Kingdom, he's warning that it could become the dominant variant here in the United States. What's your message to people who have been hesitant about getting vaccinated and the perspective of having variants like the Delta variant and potentially future variants factoring into that decision?
Well, let's look at what happened in the United Kingdom. They had the Alpha variant there that became dominant. It was more contagious and more deadly than the wild type variants that had existed before. Now this Delta variant is even more contagious, so much more so that it's actually crowded out the Alpha variant in the UK, despite their vaccination efforts thus far. And this appears to be potentially even deadlier than the other variants that we have. So we already have 6% of the variants in the US are this Delta variant. If we don't get enough people vaccinated and there are pockets of large numbers of unvaccinated people in communities, we could very well see this variant becoming dominant here in the US. And so my message to those who are not yet vaccinated but are eligible to be vaccinated, so anyone over the age of 12, they should get vaccinated now because they are still at high risk for contracting COVID-19, from dying from COVID-19. And also we have this variant and the potential of other variants developing that could actually bring us all back to square one. And that would just be totally tragic here in the US after all that we have gone through.
Yeah, we certainly do not want that. Dr. Leana Wen, thanks so much for the time.
Thank you.
And we are following new developments in a Department of Justice watchdog investigation into Trump-era probes targeting political enemies. The White House is calling the report appalling. The latest next.
Justice is pushing back against new restrictive voting laws that have been passed across the country in Republican-led states. Lawmakers in those states wrote the legislation claiming that there was a need to correct problems with the 2020 election, which many experts have declared the most secure in U.S. history. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced Friday that within the next 30 days, the department will double their Civil Rights Division's right to vote enforcement staff.
There are many things that are open to debate in America, but the right of all eligible citizens to vote is not one of them.
The department also plans to put out guidance for vote by mail and early voting ahead of the 2022 midterms. Next, this is a very important story. The wife of Georgia's Secretary of State reveals the threats that she and her family have received because of Trump's big lie, chilling messages like, quote, "We plan for the death of you and your family." More of these messages and how they are responding just ahead. Stay with us.